Hello again, kids. Here is some more information for you about the election of 1824. It was sometimes called the corrupt bargain because there was a little shady business going on with this particular election. So let's take a look. Okay, so if you look at this chart, you can see that we had actually four people running for president in 1824, which seems ridiculous now, but at the time we had four people running for president, and that was that. So I took their names off so you can just see their qualifications. So one of them was the Secretary of State under the previous president. One of them was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. One of them was the Secretary of the Treasury, and one of them was a military hero. And so if you look at the election results, I've given you a column with the popular vote count and then also the electoral vote count. So you can see that it looks to pretty much be between candidates A and D. Candidate D won the popular vote by, over 40,000 votes. And then he also won a plurality of the Electoral College votes, but he did not win a majority. Which means that we didn't have an outright winner after the electoral votes were counted. So it was still to be determined. So this is the 12th Amendment. So if you remember, after Jefferson's election, after he and Burr kind of went head-to-head in the House of Representatives for 36 votes, it became clear that the way that the Constitution originally set up voting for president wasn't working anymore. So here we have the 12th Amendment. And here's kind of the major part. It says, if no person have such a majority of electoral votes, then from the persons having the highest numbers, not exceeding 3 on the list, of those voted for as president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president, which means we've got 4 people here running for president. We're going to take the top 3, and the House of Representatives are going to choose between those top 3 people. So here is just kind of looking at historically how people, like what qualifications did people have before they became president. So George Washington, he didn't have a federal office before he became president, but he was commander of the Continental Army, as we know, and he had served in Virginia legislature as well. John Adams had been the vice president. Thomas Jefferson had been a Secretary of State under Washington, and he had been Vice President under Adams. James Madison had been a Secretary of State, and James Monroe had been Secretary of State. So you can see that of the first 5 presidents, the last 3 had had experience being Secretary of State. So it seems like that was a pattern emerging, that being Secretary of State was a good qualifier for becoming president, was a good experience that you would look for in a future president. That's not too much how it works nowadays, but at the time. So here are our candidates. We have John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State. He was from Massachusetts. We have Henry Clay, was the Speaker of the House. He was from Kentucky. We have William Crawford, who was from Georgia. He was the Secretary of Treasury. And then, of course, Andrew Jackson, who was a hero of Battle of New Orleans. And he also had success fighting against Native Americans in various parts of the country, specifically in the South. Florida is a state partially because of some of the things that Jackson did in Florida. So here are some pictures of these fellas. Again, we've got our top 3 vote getters on the top row: Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford. And then Henry Clay is out of it. That's why he's smaller and off to the side. He's not going to be considered for the presidency. So here's an electoral map, and it shows you, again, the votes that they received and where they received them from. So you can kind of see it's all over. Quincy Adams really does have control. He has a lot of popularity in the north, but that's kind of it. And then the rest of the country is kind of split. You can see Jackson has a lot of popularity, but not entirely the South, because Georgia went for Crawford, which is his home state, and Clay took Kentucky and Ohio, which is around where he's from, and then also Missouri out in the West, because he's really campaigning for the West. And remember, he is the main architect of Missouri Compromise, and so, again, Missouri went for Clay. So here are some things to consider moving forward. So the election happened in November, and shortly thereafter, William Crawford had a stroke. And so he was really not a viable candidate anymore because he was unable to walk and speak normally. So he wasn't really a viable candidate, but that was something he was still in the running. And he still got some votes in the House of Representatives. So Clay came in fourth, like we said, so he wasn't going to be considered for president, but he was Speaker of the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives was the group that was deciding who was going to be the next president. And the leader of the House of Representatives is Henry Clay, and he wants to rise. He wants, to kind of, extend his political career, and so he's got some power, and he's going to use it. And so he's going to see what he can finagle. So here's our timeline. In November, the general election takes place. On the 8th, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay have dinner together. And what is discussed? Who knows? On the haiku page, on the chapter 11 haiku page, I do have some documents there for you to look at if you want to dig a little bit deeper. I did have a skit that we were going to do, not so much anymore, but if you want to look at that, and some other documents, some primary sources about this, if you wanted to look at that as well. And some of them are from John Quincy Adams and from Henry Clay and also from Andrew Jackson. So a month after they have dinner together, the House of Representatives, led by Henry Clay, they meet and they elect John Quincy Adams as the president of the United States, who did not win the popular vote and did not have the most electoral college votes. And then a few days later, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. And so this is something that enrages Andrew Jackson, enrages his followers, his supporters, and they say that this is a corrupt bargain, that they're insinuating that Clay and Adams had conspired together, because really, if you look at a map from the way the House of Representatives voted, the states that are represented there, really only 2 states flipped the way that they were voting, and that was Ohio and I think maybe Indiana, but they were states that had previously gone for Clay, that now went for Adams. And so those are the states that really tipped the balance in favor of Adams. And it was, a lot of people are thinking that it's the influence of Clay, and he did that so that he could have a higher place in the Adams administration. And so this is just so you can kind of see how the political system up to this point had worked. We started with Washington, who didn't align with any particular political party. And we had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, who kind of jump out right away. We have our only Federalist president in John Adams. And then we get into our Democratic Republicans. That's Jefferson, that's Madison, and Monroe to some degree. And then, there's kind of the end of the Federalists. And then from Monroe, all of the people who ran in 1824 ran as kind of Democratic Republicans-ish. But after that election, then there's really political parties come back into play, because you have the people who are supporters of Jackson, who are very upset about the way this election goes. They feel like the election was stolen from them. So this is where a new political party forms, and they are calling themselves the Democrats. And the current Democrats of today, they do take their name from that political party. And so the ideologies and everything have changed, but the name of the Democratic Party starts with Andrew Jackson. And then the people who support Clay and John Quincy Adams, they start off by calling themselves the National Republicans, but it ends up being the Whigs with an H, WHIGS. And so they are around pretty much up until the Civil War. And so there's that. If you want to know more, you can always look in your textbook and online. Thank you.